For months, Jesus has been he's been preaching, he's been telling stories and getting to the heart of his message and mission in the world, and that is that there's always resurrection life on the other side of death. And he's been making his way to Jerusalem. And the invitation that he's been giving us is that all of us should follow this path of death and resurrection. And now that he's entered Jerusalem, it's time for Jesus to put his money where his mouth is. You know what I mean? He's been preaching the whole time about death and resurrection. Now he's arrived in Jerusalem, and he's going to have to sort of follow his teaching. Put his money where his mouth is. I'm terrified of bears. I don't know. I think way too much about bears for a healthy adult. It's beyond, I think, what's normal or reasonable. It started back with my favorite documentary is The Grizzly Man, of course. Anyone seen that, The Grizzly Man? Oh, you must. The greatest documentary of all time. And then, of course, I bought a book a while back. It was called When Bears Attack. I really shouldn't have read that. And of course, Leo, right, in his latest movie, The Revenant, that didn't help things much. If you saw that movie, that didn't really ease my fear of bears. We have this ongoing conversation up at the cottage, up at Kristen's family cottage. Bears are known to be in the area. There are mornings where you go out to the end of the driveway and you'll see that garbage has been torn apart by bears. They're in the area. We know they're in the area. And this, of course, makes me nervous, especially because the way the toilet system works at the cottage is there's an outhouse. And so in the middle of the night, if you get the call of nature, you have to go out into the dark, out to, you got to travel, 100 feet or something, out to this outhouse, and I'm always terrified. There's no light there. I'm terrified I'm going to run into a bear. I'm going to meet my end. So we've had this ongoing discussion. What would we do if we encountered a bear? And I have this foolproof plan. I've had it for years. I said, if I come across a bear in the middle of the night, anytime, I know I can run into the outhouse and I can jump down into the toilet, jump down there. The bear will never get me there. Never. Foolproof plan. Yes, it would not be pretty, but I would be safe, right? Now, I have been mocked for my plan. I've been told that it's foolhardy, and I've been challenged that it's actually not physically possible, to which I would counter and say, oh, you don't know me that well. If there's a bear, I will get down into the outhouse. Now, on one particular evening at the cottage, the family said, Brad, it's time to put your money where your mouth is. No, they didn't make me jump directly down. But they said, Brad, it's not physically possible for you to get down there. I said, of course it is. They said, well, we have a toilet seat, and we'd like you to prove that you could get down there. I said, game on. So they recorded this video. There is some sound, but we can't get the sound going, so I'm just going to commentate here. Here we go. Now, here's me saying, okay, could I hide in the toilet? You bet I can. Here we go. Proof. Here we go. All right, here we go. Down in. All right, I've run into a little trouble here. My hips a little wider than I thought they were. Fair enough. That's fine. I can do it this way. And I go. No bear can get me now. I'm a little stuck. And actually, now I'm more than the thing's kind of stuck on my head. All right, got to get it off. What I really needed was a volunteer, because if a bear actually came, I would just dive right in. So, could I have a volunteer, please? Here they come. Thank you, Katie. Here I go. In, and it looks like my foolproof plan is in some serious trouble. So, now I don't know what I'm going to do if a bear shows up, to be perfectly honest with you. But I had, the family the whole time for years I had been talking about my plan, and they actually unscrewed a toilet seat to see if I could get through it. Obviously, I couldn't. Now, making the transition from this to Jesus is going to take a bit of work, but bear with me. Come on, that was great, wasn't it? No. All right. I like that. Where am I going here? Okay. Jesus, this is such a weak transition. Jesus has to put his money where his mouth is. He's been traveling to Jerusalem talking about death and resurrection, and now he finds himself in Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, on the eve of his trial, on the eve of his crucifixion and death, Jesus has just finished his final meal with his closest followers. And after an emotional and intense evening of farewells and instructions to his disciples, Jesus now has less than 24 hours to live. And so in these final moments, Jesus once again looks for a place of respite, a place to catch his breath, a place to focus away from the distractions around him. And for Jesus, the wilderness has always been that. It's always been that for him. It's always been the place that he sought out when life was feeling too much. It's always been his retreat. Whenever he was on the eve of a major moment in his life, he always sought refuge in the wilderness. And so about to turn the page into the final chapter of his life, he once again goes in search of wilderness. But being within Jerusalem, he doesn't have the luxury of escaping to the summit of some mountain. He doesn't have the option of heading way out into the desert. So he heads to the only piece of wilderness that he can find. Just east, take a look here, just east of Jerusalem is the valley of Jehoshaphat, or the Kidron Valley. And down through the valley and up the other side lies the Mount of Olives and the Garden of Gethsemane. It's as close to the wilderness as he can find. It's no mountain peak, but it promises quiet and solitude. It has some trees for him to prepare and pray in. And it's night, and it's dark. And there's not much time left. And the scene we witness of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane is just so penetratingly lonely. If you read the account in Matthew or Luke, it's heart-wrenching. Alone, he's standing on the precipice between life and death. He's faced with putting his money where his mouth is. In that moment, he's overcome with doubt. Read this in Luke 22. Jesus went out, as usual, to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. I get so frustrated with the gospel writers because the details we are given of Jesus' anguished prayer here is just so tantalizingly small, isn't it? We're only given the barest of details. In fact, all we really know is how Jesus begins his prayer, how he ends his prayer. He begins with, "There's got to be another way." He ends with, "Not my will, but your will be done." But in between those two cries, in this a couple hours of prayer that Jesus is in, what was going on? What was the essence of Jesus' struggle? And I've come to think that ultimately this was a struggle for Jesus between trust and doubt. God had led him through the desert of temptation. He had taken him through the path of love. He had taken him and guided him down the path of death and resurrection towards Jerusalem. But now, in this moment, this final hour, his question is, can God really be trusted? His question to God is there not some other way? God, can I really trust you? Can I really trust this path you've laid out for me? Are you sure this is the best way? Can I trust you? And I think if we're honest with ourselves about our doubts, our struggles in faith, are they not the sort of same questions? God, can I really trust you? Are you really a trustworthy God? Given what I know of you, or what I presume to know of you from Scripture, what I know of the world, are you a God who can actually be trusted? And this was Jesus' moment of doubt. And I happen to think most of our doubts are related to this trust issue. And so Jesus is struggling with trust. And I so badly wish we were given more details about these few hours in the garden. As he struggled to trust God, as he languished in doubt, did he think about running? Can't help but wonder. Did he think about running? Maybe there was still enough time to get away. If he left with the disciples right now, maybe Judas, the soldiers, maybe they wouldn't find him. I mean, we can only imagine this part of the story, but part of me also can't help but wonder this. I can't help but wonder if some of the stories Jesus told on his way to Jerusalem started echoing through his head. We've been looking at the parables, and I can't help but wonder as Jesus is sweating with doubt in the garden, if some of the stories he had been telling were echoing through his mind. In particular, there's a story that Jesus used to tell, one of his old tales called the parable of the weeds, and it's a story about trust and how we respond to it. And in my imagination, at least, I become convinced that this story must have crossed Jesus' mind as he went and struggled with doubt in the garden. Parable of the weeds. Here's how it goes. Jesus told them another parable. This is before transfiguration. This is early Jesus' work here. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came, sowed weeds among the wheat, and went away. When the weeds sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servant came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. Servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you're pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring them into my barn." Now, this parable to me is so rich. I don't want to jump immediately to the parts I think must have been rattling around in Jesus' mind. Let me point out a few things. First, God's kingdom is universal. Christ's kingdom is universal. Jesus speaks of one man's field, and the entire field has been sown. It's not partially sown. The whole field is sown. I think it's a strong indication that there is no places, no times, no people in which God's kingdom is not already at work. Second, I'm fascinated by the dilemma. See, the dilemma for the servants and the farmer has nothing to do with the health of the wheat. It seems that these weeds in no way interfere with the growing of the wheat. There's no danger to the good crop's growth. That's not the issue. The issue seems to be the farmer and his servants' convenience. This is just highly inconvenient. The good crop will be fine. The problem is now there's a whole lot of bad mixed in with the good. And that's going to be a royal pain to try to separate. Which to me, I think means this is a classic parable of good versus evil. How do we respond to evil in this world? What is to be done? And to me, this is why I can't help but think this parable, the story of Jesus, must have been rattling around in his mind as he's waiting in the garden, waiting for evil to come and take him. Because notice what the servants suggest. The servant's idea here is what every good gardener knows to be true. There's weeds, let's go pull them out, right? Weeds, well, that's a pain, let's go yank them out. The servant's idea is really straightforward, it's really logical, it makes a whole lot of sense. Their idea is this: let's take immediate and direct action against the weeds, this evil that's coming to the crop. Let's go there, bring out the Roundup, bring out the hose, it's time to pull up some weeds. Now, interestingly enough, this exact scenario sort of plays out in the Garden of Gethsemane just a few hours later. In the garden, the disciples are there, and Judas comes with the soldiers to arrest Jesus, and the disciples think, what? Here comes evil, time to do some weeding. Evil descends on Jesus. The disciples think, okay, time to take care of this. And so we know the story, John 18:10. Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. Servant's name was Malchus. And of course, the rest of the story is that Jesus tells him to stop, heals the man's ear. But the disciples are playing the role of the servants. Oh, there's evil? Let's strike it. Let's fight against it. Let's do some weeding. And so the idea in this parable is, right, to confront evil, to fight against it, that's the way to go. Take direct, immediate action. And yet the farmer's plan is radically different. Farmer's plan for dealing with evil is essentially this: nope, no weeding, just let them grow together. I think you could say this. What's this parable trying to say? How do we confront evil in the world? According to this parable of Jesus, the best response is this: do nothing. Do nothing. And I can sense every single activist in the room, everyone who's passionate about some cause, some injustice in the world, screaming, that's absurd. Do nothing? Ludicrous. In fact, doing nothing is what's wrong with the world. I'm sure many of us are familiar with a quote by Edmund Burke. It says this: the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men, good people, to do nothing. So farmer says, nope, do nothing. And my inclination is to think, well, that's about the worst piece of advice I've ever heard. And yet I can't help but think that this parable must have been rattling around in Jesus' mind in the garden. For the farmer, the best response to evil is, for now, do nothing. And I think Jesus internalized this story. He replays this story in his mind as he wrestles in the garden, because when the soldiers and Judas come for him, he did nothing. When his disciples go to fight, Jesus tells them to put away their swords and do nothing. In fact, Jesus responds to his disciples. He says, wait, you're going to fight for me? Are you kidding? Do you realize that I could call 12 legions of angels if I want to? No. Instead, we're going to do nothing. And then Jesus is taken before the Sanhedrin and tried, and he stands there and does nothing. So they take him to Pilate, and Jesus does nothing. And then they take him to Herod, and Herod wants him to do a whole bunch of magic tricks. Instead, Jesus stands there and does nothing. And so they go back to Pilate, and Pilate says, don't you realize that I have the power of life and death over you? And Jesus does nothing. And then they take him, and they whip him, and they torture him, and Jesus does nothing. And then finally, hanging on the cross, the crowds taunt and mock him. And they basically say this: if you are who you say you are, then do something. And Jesus instead does nothing. Nothing. Do nothing. And in case it isn't obvious by now, I think the do nothing that Jesus does is not some sort of passive, thoughtless nothing. It's a subversive kind of doing nothing. It's an absorbing kind of doing nothing. For the farmer, for the God figure, the Christ figure of the parable, the proper response to evil is to absorbingly do nothing. Sometimes the best plan of action is to wait. And this seems to be God's plan for evil in the world, and we're asked to somehow trust this. But why? Why not fight evil? Why not, like in Lord of the Rings, why not ride out to meet evil? Why not take direct and immediate action against it? I think the parable offers us such a beautiful, powerful clue. When the parable tells us, where'd my ear thing go? This enemy sowed weed among the wheat, the text is actually very much specific. It's not just weeds, it's actually zizania. It's specifically darnel. It's, next slide, in the Latin, lolium temulentum. There you go, like I know. But that's what it's referring to, is darnel. Darnel. It's an annual grass that grows alongside wheat, and it's considered a weed. And the problem with darnel is that it looks dramatically like wheat. It looks almost identical to wheat, which is precisely the problem. It's a powerful commentary in my mind. Evil can often play the role of good. It can often parade as good. Good can often be mistaken for evil. Beware, I would say, the person who thinks they know the difference. Be careful what you go attacking and yanking up in this world. On the evening of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, doing that back in January, I was out with some friends. Got a call from Kristen, or some frantic text: you need to get home right away. We've been robbed. What? Looking at my phone, trying to still socialize over dinner. What's going on? So finally, I'm like, okay, I think I need to go. So I go home, I come home, Kristen is in hysterics. What's going on? Somebody had hacked into our bank account and withdrawn all of our money, which admittedly wasn't exactly a lot, but still. Somebody had taken everything. So we're frantically trying to call the bank. Have we lost this money? Can we stop this? Can we shut this down? And the next 2 weeks were just a nightmare trying to go through all the red tape with banks and whatnot. Well, we realized what ended up happening is this. A few weeks prior, Kristen had received an email from CIBC. Is she in here? No? Good. From CIBC. And the email said, we're having some problems with your bank account. Please click on the link and enter your personal information. So to the link she clicks, and it looks identical to CIBC's website. In fact, we were told later that the only difference, if she had looked carefully, is up in the website bar. Instead of CIBC.com, it probably read CIBC.de or something odd like that. So Kristen logs on. Oh, a problem. Oh, hey. Enters the account information. Boom. We later learned that somebody actually took the information. They personally, in person, walked into a bank in Winnipeg, set up a new account, said, I've moved from Kitchener to Winnipeg, and I'd like to withdraw everything. And they did it. I'm like, CIBC. Anyway, did it. Because it all stems back to this. The real and the fake looked identical, almost exactly the same. I think that's what this parable is trying to point out. You know, sometimes good and evil look remarkably similar. Sometimes it's not so easy to tell the difference. And you see, the farmer's rationale here for waiting is this: absorbingly do nothing, because if you pull up the weeds, if you pull up the bad in this world, chances are you're going to pull up the wheat. You're going to pull up the good right along with it. And it's such a deep story in my mind if we would only listen to it, because in our world, all of our programs we devise to get rid of evil are doomed, I would say, to do exactly what the farmer suggests it's going to do. If we go frantically attacking and pulling out weeds in this world, we're going to tear up the wheat right alongside it. There's powerful symbolism in this story, because good and evil, they commonly inhabit not only the same field, but I would say each of us as well. It cuts right down the middle of each and every one of us. And I think what this parable points to, this powerful truth, there's no such thing as unqualified good people or unqualified good countries or good sides, and there's no such thing as unqualified bad people or bad nations or bad sides. And yet so often that's the categories we play with, right? Where's evil? Well, Muslims are bad, China's bad, North Korea's bad, 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 bad. On the other side, well, conservatives are bad, these people are bad. We love putting people into categories, good and bad. But this parable is way too smart for that. It knows good and evil runs right down the middle of each of us, and the two oftentimes look remarkably similar. And the reality, I think, is this: if we're going to start a campaign to rid this world of evil, it will only end with basically the complete destruction of all of us. The farmer says, no. Let's wait. Let them grow together. I will separate them at a later time. Because I think this enemy is incredibly clever. This enemy knows all he has to do is sprinkle a little bit of bad, and good people will do his work for him. If I can sucker them into taking up against these weeds, not only will they destroy evil, but they'll pull up good right alongside it. And I've come to think that goodness, when it uses power, can end up doing far more harm than good. And if there are some here worrying that this sermon might be leaning towards pacifism, you should continue to worry. But let's say I think we need to make a distinction. The parable, it seems to me, doesn't say that resistance to evil is morally wrong. It just says it's completely ineffective. It's ineffective. And here's what I think. I think we can make all the case we want for just war or capital punishment or any other logical, reasonable, power-based solution to the presence of evil on earth. I think we can make the cases all we want. What I don't think we can do is this: assume that those solutions do anything to make the world a better place. Because we can take up the sword, but like Peter, Jesus says to him, those who do will die by it. And I think the point of the parable here is this: in the face of evil, our response is to do nothing. Not a passive or thoughtless nothing, but a firm and absorbing kind of nothing. Jesus didn't go to the cross and suffer passively. He went there actively, an active nothing, an active resistance by nothing. And I think the distinction is critical, but ultimately comes back to the issue of trust. Do we believe that God will ultimately take away the weeds of the world? Do we believe God is capable of ridding each and every one of us of our darker impulses? I think that's the question. Do we trust the story? You know, in the garden, faced with coming evil, Jesus, he wavers, he stumbles here, he doubts. He's having a hard time trusting God's plan. But in the end, he believed that doing nothing in the most profound way possible, God would deliver on his promise to resurrect and vindicate him. And the question for each of us, whether it's on a global scale or a much more personal scale, is the same. Do we trust God enough to do nothing? To simply absorb, simply take in the bad, the wrongs when we're faced with them? You know, the case of evil, the question of evil is a big theologian's question. Philosopher's question, love to debate. Why does evil exist? Where did it come from? It's interesting to me because in Scripture, the only answer that we ever get to the problem of evil is this: an enemy did it. All of our big sort of fancy ideas about where evil came from, why it exists, Scripture basically points to what the farmer says. Where does evil come from? An enemy did it. That's the only answer we get from Scripture. And I would suggest this. If you can accept that, then there are really only two other important questions that remain. The first is this: whose side are you on? And second, whose methods do you propose to use in dealing with the problem? In this parable, I love this certain line. There's this line in the parable that's fascinating to me. Servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you're pulling up the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. Pull up evil, you'll pull up goodness right along with it." And that remarkable phrase there is actually a form of the Greek word aphesis. And it's interesting because in this parable, of course, we translate it as send away, let go, permit, permit them to grow together. But a lot of times in the New Testament, this word is actually, when it's applied to debts, when it's applied to sins, it's translated as forgive. Forgive. In the English, we read the parable as let them both grow together, but perhaps there's an even deeper meaning. The malice and evil and badness that exists in our world, in the lives of all of us, is not to be dealt with by attacking or abolishing or trying to weed it out. It's rather to be dealt with by aphesis, forgiveness, a doing nothing, an absorbing that can only be described as forgiveness, a suffering, a permission, all rolled into one. And I'm convinced that as Jesus is there in the garden on his knees, sweating blood in doubt, this story must have been rattling around in his mind. As he went there and struggled with, what do I do? It's time to put my money where my mouth is, but now I'm wavering, I'm struggling. And ultimately, he decides to trust. And as he does so, he goes to the cross and is subjected to the evil of the world. And what I find fascinating is on the cross, Jesus utters what? "Father, forgive them. Forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." To follow Jesus in this kind of living requires great trust. A trust many of us, I think, like Jesus, we will stumble with, we will doubt, we'll have a hard time clinging to. And of course we would. It's not easy to trust. And if Jesus sweat blood over this, you can count on us sweating blood as well. And ultimately, as we lead up to Easter and the week after Easter, we're going to talk about what it means to trust God, because it's not easy. It's not easy, because what the story simply asks us to accept and trust is this: at the end, there is ultimate triumph over evil. God is in charge, and God will ultimately get his way. This field, this world, each of us will eventually have the weeds of evil and sin separated from us, but first, we're asked to simply trust. I suspect it won't be easy. But Jesus walks into his arrest, his trial, his torture, his crucifixion, doing nothing but absorbing, trusting that in the end God would raise him up, vindicate him, have love and goodness triumph over evil, and God does. Now the same is asked of us. I'm going to ask the band to come as we close. Actually, what time is it? 20. Do we want to do questions or? No? Oh. See some there? Yeah. 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 Yeah, I would say this. Absolutely. I think one of the points of the parable is the kingdom is everywhere, at work everywhere, and it's going to do its work. The weeds don't threaten that. So there's also a trust thing. God's going to do his work. The wheat is going to grow. That's the fascinating thing to me. That's never in question. It's not like the farmer and servants are going, oh my goodness, this is going to destroy the wheat. No, it's, oh my goodness, now we have to try to separate the two. That's just a major inconvenience. So, in terms of what we're asked to do, I think it points to, in my mind, again, the kingdom is going to do its work, with or without us on side. The wheat's going to grow. So yeah, there's a tremendous amount of beauty there that no matter what is sown in the world, God's kingdom, the wheat, will grow, will do its work. We can expect to find beauty and love and forgiveness everywhere because the wheat is growing. Sarah. Yeah, and you know what? You always catch me on this. I'm always being hyperbolic, right? I love the do nothing because it's like what? But I think the easiest example is the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King marching in Selma and other places, right? They're actually doing something very powerful, but they're sort of a sort of doing nothing, resisting there and absorbing whatever brutality the police threw at them. So and it's the same way in my mind as Jesus goes to the cross. He's making a powerful statement by doing nothing. He's simply absorbing what they throw at him. Make sense? You always call me out when I'm being intentionally provocative. We're going to end with, what are we ending with?
It's a tune that I think we first did in January. Down in the Lowlands.
Mm-hmm.
By Charlie Peacock. And if you know it, sing along every word. If you don't, there's a part where you can do a response with us. Save.
You give us a little cue there?
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right, let's do this song, and then we will go in peace. And I trust you have a wonderful. I'll come up after.